Back when the customer was always right, as long as he knew which card to swipe, sellers would likely get reprimanded for selling a lemon as lime rebranded. Today, though, we're living in different times. Technology, mass media, Shonda rhymes, making once passive, ignorant consumers self-certified doctors, experts, and lawyers. Thereby, the double-edged sword unsheathed towards clients hunting in great territory. They're always right, on time, precise, unless Google search should say otherwise. So how were sellers allowed to obtain attitudes like share, doused in propane? Hold on, system down, rebooted, reshared. Warning, consumer has become self-aware. And as a result, buying culture has changed to a battle of wits that's somewhat deranged. Gauguin spoke of public need to understand in a day what it took the artist years to comprehend. So, smarty pants iBuyer, since you I know it all, can I shop this, I price that, until you I fall, and alone you'll fight, rise, fall, rise, fight. Wow, fully charged, you're unstoppable, right? One little thing you might have I forgotten, skill isn't an app you download through a button. And meanwhile, some consumers are guilty as sin of gleaning instead of actually learning, which makes them targets on hunting ground, leveled by info surplus now going around. Spectators of this sport full of hunger gamers watch from box seats reserved for retailers. All you need to know about that echelon, really, is they're not ones to ever get their hands dirty. And furthermore, marketplace practice and laws are increasingly decided by public thought brawls. So, put your money where your mouth is, or buyer beware, aka caveat emptor. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It just got real Shakespearean in here, huh? I don't know if we'll be able to follow with that rhyme. My name is Ariel Adams, and welcome to our discussion about the consumer experience, as Dominique so eloquently introduced. I am joined by James Dowling, Christophe Nicaise, and Shimon Rist, who will be joining us digitally in order to protect anonymity. Oh, look, I rhymed. I have a bunch of questions that have been pre-approved. We are supposed to talk about some controversial issues here, and I'd say that the consumer experience really boils down all the controversy in the industry right now. So the first question, and anyone that wants to respond can, is this. How do you respond to the notion that the luxury watch industry has a serious last mile problem, as I call it? What I mean by that is that the industry does a very good job of getting people to be aware and desire a watch, yet once they're interested in buying it, there's a lot of roadblocks. How would you respond to that? Do you agree, disagree?
Well, it depends what kind of roadblocks we're talking about.
Somebody becomes interested in a watch. Naturally, as consumers do today, they are going to go online to get a little bit more information, and they're presented with a number of purchase options, many of which they may not understand, even us as extreme experts. So by the last mile problem, I say going from formation of desire to actually facilitating a purchase. Traditionally, there were less routes to making that purchase. Today, through omni-channel, there's so many, I claim that it's too many, and it's causing problems.
Well, the whole watch industry ecosystem has been growing. I mean, you used to have a very simple dual relationship, the brand, the retailer, and today it's no longer the case. Like you said, there are so many other touch points. So how the consumer will find his way through all these different touch points might explain that sometimes he got lost on the way. So the important part is to look at how you're going to get back the customer and feel him comfortable on one of these touch points.
So here in the UAE especially, people are very social media connected. Very social media connected. And they are learning about products online. Yet you don't necessarily want them to always buy online, you want them to go into the store. What is your strategy to get them in the store, Christophe?
The Middle East has some differences with some other parts of the world. Yes, the customer will do all the research online, as you rightly said, but at the same time, the importance of personal relationship is probably very high and more important here than in other place in the world. So customer will have this, always this feeling of, okay, I need to interact with someone. I need to get reassured, I need to engage in a conversation. So that's why here people will still go more often to the store than in other parts of the world.
So you agree it's an issue, but you believe that the solution are increased personal relationships.
Yeah, I think even though everything happens online or somewhere else, the importance of building relationship is still extremely important, and that will help actually the customer not to get lost on all these touch points.
Well, let's see what Mr. Shame has to say about that. Okay, Shame on wrist. How do you respond to the fact that there is a problem between the formation of desire, you want to buy a watch, and when you go online, there's so many options, it prevents a lot of purchases that would otherwise occur? Would you like to respond, James, while we were waiting for the typing?
I think that there's a couple of other things that we have to think about too, is that when somebody goes online to research the purchase of a watch, not only do they get a list of options where they can buy the thing, they get an even bigger list of opinions about it. And I sometimes think that the online experience could actually be more confusing rather than reassuring.
So you brought up an interesting point about opinions, and one of those big opinions is about price. Price is probably the biggest issue in the room when it comes to the purchase of watches. And consumers are presented with prices all over the place. That's a relatively new phenomenon in this grand scheme of the watch industry. In your careers, what have you seen as being some of the direct outcomes of consumers being able to see a lot more prices?
I think that having so many information of different prices can be confusing to the end consumer. But I think we cannot remove from the equation that a certain price brings you a certain level of service or benefits. So yes, you can go for a cheaper option, but when deciding on this cheaper option, and most of the time if it's an online, non-authorized option, what is your, how can you make sure that watch is genuine? What is the authentication process of that watch? What type of after-sale service you will get for that watch? So I think it's then how, again, educating the customer. Yes, you have different options on the table. If it's just about the price, well, be my guest, you might opt for a cheaper option, but then be sure of what you get for that price.
Well, let me push a little bit here, because yes, this traditional thing of, are you sure you're buying real? We know that the amount, when people buy a fake watch, they usually know what they're getting. It's very uncommon for someone to get a fake watch when they don't think they're getting a fake watch. So do you think that your argument about paying more for these special extra services is relevant to consumers? It's not a bad argument, but is it working?
I would believe yes. I would believe absolutely yes. And again, it comes back to the first element of the discussion, which is about building relationship with someone. So for some customers, this is extremely important. Then after building this relationship, if you have this extra service, which I think are not just nice to have services, but kind of a must-have services that you probably want to pay a certain amount of money and be sure that that particular watch you're buying is going to be guaranteed for some times. And going back to fake, and I'm sure you're aware as much as I am aware, there are some instances where people have been paying premium money at auction for a certain watch, and when the watch was actually opened, one of the parts of that watch was not what it was expected to be. So fake is a general word, but can mean different things that can impact the price of the watch.
What do you think, James? Do you think that consumers are persuaded by the argument that if they pay the full retail price, they get valuable services additionally with it?
Well, I think that watch buyers are caught in an interesting position in between the retailer and the manufacturer. The argument that Christophe has presented is that the reason you buy from an authorized retailer is that you get the full backup for service and what have you. But the simple truth is that nowadays, manufacturers are saying that our watches, using the new lubricants, using the new technology, silicone, etc., are so reliable they don't need servicing for 5, 8, 10 years. So in that case, what do you need the retailer for?
An excellent point. And I think that Christophe would probably say the relationship. So how can you create a relevant relationship with consumers these days whereby some of these traditional arguments like warranty and authenticity aren't necessarily as important to the consumer? What in the relationship, what specific elements of that is worth the additional money when consumers are faced with these options?
Working with the Siddiqui company, my answer will or might sound biased, but I would say education is a big part and a big role of what retailers in today's market should be doing.
What kind of education?
I mean, education on whatever the customer needs to know about a product. I'm looking at Shimon Rees because we're not really going back to his question, but for example, he's saying there, if it's purely monetary, then of course the main objective will be the price of the watch, but it goes beyond the price of the watch. I mean, there is emotional value in a watch. There are a lot of nice stories to tell the end consumer to help him navigate this confusing ecosystem. I agree with you, the guarantee becomes less of an issue. Some brands just announced recently they will offer an 8 years guarantee on a product. But still, there will be a time where servicing your watch with a trusted partner will be important. So education can mean a lot of different things.
But as we've also discussed, an educated consumer is an experienced consumer who knows that there's different prices out there, that knows what that experience of owning the watch is like. For example, yeah, it's probably not going to break. So how do you create the right type of education without perhaps over-empowering the consumer? Because consumers today truly feel like they have more tools and information than ever before, which is true. I don't know that they all know what to do with it, but there's this hesitation that comes with so much education, right? You know so much, yet you aren't sure what to do next. So you say that education is important, and I agree, but how do you structure that education to be in the interest of the industry?
I think that the big problem with social media we have now is that, in fact, a consumer can finish up with too much education and find themselves in a situation in which they can't actually make a decision. It's easy to make a decision when the decision is only about price because numbers are very easy. One's bigger than the other. That's not a problem. But opinions are very difficult to decide. Who do you decide? Who do you believe when there are 150, 20 opinions there? What do you decide? And if you spend any time on the social media forums discussing watches, the most common question that's asked is, do I go for the Omega Seamaster or do I go for the Submariner? Or it's always, is it this one or is it that one? And of course, the people who answer will almost invariably be somebody who owns one of the two and say, oh, this one's great and the other one's crap, and vice versa. So how does anybody make a decision? And I think that's the situation in which a retailer has actually an important role.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that point. I was about to react, and actually, we need to go back to basic. You know, the actual sales skills required on the sales floor. I mean, one of the key things is discover your customer needs. Help your customer discover what they really want. If it's only a wide choice of option on the internet or on social media, and he's alone facing this choice, I think having a salesperson or rather than a salesperson, an advisor taking his hand through the journey and help him discovering exactly what is his need might be the answer to, okay, I can narrow down my choice now because someone has been helping me defining precisely what I was looking for.
So I'm going to flip the question upside down about education. The consumer, more often than not, I hear this all the time, I'm sure you do as well, they complain that the retailer lacks sufficient education. They don't want to do business with a retailer that doesn't know what they're talking about. They can't speak on the same level. So there's all this discussion about consumer education, but who is involving themselves in seriously investing in retailer education so that more retailers can do exactly what you're talking about?
I think you have to look back at the role that retailers have, and your average watch retailer will sell 6, 10, 12 brands, plus they'll also sell jewelry. And the person behind the desk, behind the counter, has to have a decent level of knowledge in all of those. They can't have complete in-depth knowledge of everything. The problem is that nowadays, with the internet, customers come in having researched something for 2 months, read everything about it, and know much, much more than the poor sales clerk. And I think this is also a reason that we're seeing a huge rise in the number of monobrand boutiques, where the people behind the counter there certainly will know a great deal, sometimes almost as much as the customer.
Yeah, when you have a multi-brand and you have, let's say, 15, 20 brands represented in that particular multi-brand, it's hard for any of the advisors to be expert of each and every single brand. But I think it's the duty of the retailer to invest into training and make sure that as the consumer knows more and more, whoever is lagging behind this knowledge get to be trained properly and be able to interact with the consumer at more or less the same level of knowledge. But again, a consumer still might know more than the advisor, regardless of the amount of training you've been putting. But then it opens up a conversation between the two, and through that, again, I'm going back to building a personal relationship. They can still engage in a positive way, even if it's not about the knowledge of that particular brand or model. And through this relationship building, you can still achieve a lot in the process.
So here's what I'm hearing from you. I'm hearing that you're saying that people, when you say relationship, I'm translating it to this. People want to buy watches from friends, right? And barring other types of values like a good price or things like that, you want to buy from someone who you're friendly with. You talked about the importance of investing in this education, both in creating relationships and the product. In your company, specifically, what areas do you invest in to create those types of more empowered retailers?
About more than 10 years ago, when Dubai was actually hitting a crisis, it was the financial crisis 2008. What the Siddiqui Group decided at that time, and although it was challenging times, you're in a major economic crisis, we decided that since we might have less traffic in the store, that it was a good opportunity to actually take the time that was made free and invest into training. And we created, from that time, our own training center. I will almost call it a watch knowledge school. And since 2008, all our sales associate advisors are going through continuous training. Sometimes this training is also complemented by initiatives that the brands will take themselves on new product launch or on new initiatives. So our teams are constantly trained. And they are always encouraged to also do their own research and to complement the knowledge we are giving them with their own development.
I'd like to move it slightly sideways, because I think what we're neglecting is the other half of the market. The other half of the market is in used watches, and that market is developing at a huge rate. It's becoming commercialized to a very large extent. We're seeing the partnership between Siddiqui and Watchbox. We're seeing the sale of Watchfinder in the UK to the Richemont Group. And what was pretty much a wild west in the used watch market is now become very formalized and structured. And I think it's important to realize how vital the second-hand watch market is to the new watch market, because the fact that somebody can look up on Chrono24 or on Watchfinder and see that their Speedmaster is worth £3,000 is what convinces them that it's okay to spend £4,000 buying it new. It underwrites the value. It tells them that there is something there. And what I'm interested in talking about now is how the second-hand market has become a very serious part of the business of the actual watch industry. How many of the brands are getting into selling their own product, they're buying it back, refurbing it and selling it. Vacheron were one of the first in there. And I had lunch last month with the CEO of one of the largest watch groups in Europe. And he said to me, the biggest brand we sell is Rolex. The second biggest brand we sell is used watches. And given the choice, I would much sooner sell a used watch than a new watch from any brand. Because if I'm selling a brand new Rolex, Rolex tell me how many watches I have to buy. They tell me how big the display has to be, where it has to be in the store, who it can't be next to, and what have you. When I sell a used watch, I can decide my margin. I can decide exactly what the market will bear. I can put it next to an Omega on the shelf. Nobody cares. And so I'm in control.
James, thank you for making that point. That brings me to my next topic here, and that really is about what Shimon Riss says about this strange demonization of the gray market. And that goes to your point that a lot of the people who are in sales of watches actually prefer the gray market because it allows them to be more entrepreneurial. They don't have all these sometimes archaic restrictions on how their displays need to look and what placement and things like that. It's actually a more clean way of selling watches because a retailer can really understand the consumer and cater things to the consumer as opposed to catering to the people making what it is that they're selling. So how do we reconcile the fact that there's a lot of things to learn from the gray market, but in a systemic look at the industry, all these discounted prices essentially train people to never spend retail? How do you reconcile the two worlds of authorized and gray market so it's one healthy system?
Okay, we have to go back in history more than 50 years, and we talk what is normally talked about as the quartz crisis, when essentially the Swiss watch industry collapsed. Now, the onset of quartz had something to do with it, but it wasn't the only thing. In fact, the main thing, in my opinion, that caused it to collapse was a decision by Richard Nixon to float the dollar on the international market. And that had the effect of raising the value of the dollar by about 40% against the Swiss franc. And it made the price of Swiss watches in the US, which at that time was their biggest market, almost unaffordable. And the dollar floated. It found its own market. It had been there were fixed exchange rates, known as the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II. What we're seeing now, and the grey market is showing us, is that watches no longer have a fixed price. So, for example, when I bought a Nautilus about 19 years ago, I got a discount. And I didn't have to argue hard. I simply said, yeah, if I pay cash, oh yeah, no problem. Now, I have to beg to get on a waiting list. But if I want to buy an Omega Genève, if the list price is X, I know that I can buy it for X minus so-and-so. What we're seeing is what happens to the dollar. It's floating. The value of watches is floating. It is determined by the market now, not by the prices that manufacturers set.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the prices are fluctuating like crazy in some instances. And like you said, in some instances, the consumer is actually dictating the price because it's a reflection of supply and demand. And I think this is just, I would believe it's just a temporary situation, and it shouldn't last too long. But yeah, you have to deal with this. Sometimes I would almost say nonsense because some watches are just doubling in prices because of the rarity. So again, supply and demand scenario.
Okay, so let's talk about supply and demand because there's something very interesting in the watch industry happening right now. There's good reasons behind it, and that is this. There is an enormous amount of watches out there for anyone that wants a nice watch. Yet, there are a couple of core models out there from a couple of brands that seem to have this sort of overinflated sense of interest around them, right? It's like the one restaurant that everyone tells you should go to has a line around the corner. There's a restaurant next door which is empty. Why is it that everyone is standing in line for the first restaurant and no one's like, maybe we should go to the place that does want our money? So why are consumers today continually trying to go after watches that don't seem to want them as purchasers when there's so many available options out there that are just ripe for the picking?
I think what we have to acknowledge is the role that fashion plays in the watch industry. Essentially, the rule of fashion is that it comes and goes. It doesn't last forever. If it lasts forever, it's not fashion, it's a classic. I've been collecting watches for almost 35 years, and I remember an auction in 1999 at Sotheby's. I was going through some catalogs the other day, so I was throwing things out, clearing my shelves. And I looked at this catalog, and I noticed that I'd written down all the prices, because I was actually at the auction. And there was a page, and on the page was a black-dialed 6238, sorry, the pre-Daytona chronograph. There were 2 screw-down Oyster chronographs, Daytonas, and there were 2 non-screw-down Paul Newmans. The prices I'd written down, the pre-Daytona was passed. Nobody wanted to buy it at $3,000. The 2 non-Paul Newmans sold for $4,000 and a bit each, and the Paul Newmans were $8,000. So it was $30,000 would have bought you the whole page. I looked further through that catalogue, and about 5 pages on were some bubble backs. And I noted that I'd bought 2 of those bubble backs, and I paid $12,000 for those 2 bubble backs. I probably sold them for $15 a month or so later, or sometime later. But right now, if I owned those 2 bubble backs, I couldn't get $15,000 for them. But I could get $1 million for that page of watches that you could have bought for $30,000. And those watches are exactly the same as they were then. It's just now that the Daytonas are fashionable and the bubble backs aren't fashionable. And unless we acknowledge the role of fashion in this business, we're going to be banging our heads against the wall all the time. And I'd be brutally honest, the Nautilus, the Royal Oak, the Submariner are fashionable watches right now. They are no different than they were 10 years ago when, when the market said they were worth a third or a quarter of their price?
I cannot agree more on what you just said. I think it's just that, and again, being fashionable has a big impact on the demand. Everybody wants one. So that's how it is. And as retailers, we just need to try to get as much supplies as we can so we can please as many customers as we can.
Do you think that the internet's ability to create hyper attention around a relatively small number of products inflates the problem of fashionability, as James says? Meaning that fashion comes from various types of fashion leaders, and that changes around the world by taste. But since everyone is going to the same websites and everyone is seeing the same accounts on social media, what ends up happening is the fashion leaders tend to be less and less and less. So how is it that today we can create more fashion leaders to help rally around more of a variety of watches? Because the amount of people in the world today, and the amount of watch lovers, it doesn't really make sense that there's only like a dozen models that are fashionable at any given time, when there's thousands upon thousands of different excellent watches available at any given moment.
What makes a watch fashionable or not is an organic thing. It's not a controlled thing. And look at what Tudor are doing with David Beckham and Lady Gaga, and still they're not hitting the high points. All of their stuff is available at retail. The watches that are hot are there because there is a groundswell of desire particularly on the various social forums, whether it's the chat forums or whether it's Instagram and Facebook. I think that's where the action is coming from.
I think to elaborate a little bit more on this conversation, yes, the fashion element is playing an important role for these few models, but you cannot look to it without looking at the fact that there is rarity on these models. I'm sure if the production of these few models was to rise and the demand being fulfilled, the whole thing, like a financial bubble, will probably come to a more reasonable attitude. So the conjunction of both super high fashionable, high demand and rarity makes it what it is today. And I understand the rarity as well is a key element of luxury. What is luxury? Luxury is something rare.
So let's take the conversation back to the retailer. A very common thing that happens today, and this relates to exactly what we're talking about, is retailers will tell a customer that they believe this watch will go up in value, or that it's destined to go up in value, or look at the prices it's going for. Do you think that the retailer is somewhat responsible for fanning the flames of having people possibly purchase watches for the wrong reasons as a financial instrument, as opposed to a self-celebratory item that you wear to make yourself feel good about yourself?
In Britain, any financial institution, such as an insurance company or anything which is selling stock, has to put a disclaimer at the bottom of their advert saying that past performance is no guarantee of future performance. And I think that anybody who actually sells it's a different thing if you're selling a share, which somebody buys a share not because they want to look at the pretty share certificate, they buy it because they expect to make money. If you buy a watch, my rule has always been you buy a watch because you love it. And if it goes up in value, that's an additional bonus, but it's not the main reason you bought it. If the main reason you bought that watch is so you can flip it, then you're not a collector. You are, believe it or not, you're a watch dealer.
I completely agree. I think it's for a retailer, any retailer, to use as a sales argument, oh yeah, buy this watch because I can guarantee you it will increase in value, I would say, and I would use a very strong word, it's irresponsible, because no one can guarantee what's going to happen. And that removes all the emotions around the product. And like James said, I mean, you buy a watch because you love it. And if the watch increase in value, yes, additional bonus. If it loses its financial value, if you bought it because you love it, you don't care, you know, because the emotion is there. And again, I also believe, I said luxury is all about rarity, but it's also a business of emotion, because who needs a watch today anyway? You know, when you have the time here on your mobile, and it's so you have to keep all these elements in mind when you're actually purchasing a watch. And I think the passion, the love for the product, the emotion that it creates for you, and how you relate to that product are key. It's not, oh, I'm making a financial investment, that watch will double in
But
price.
a financial investment is an emotion, and the argument I'm making is that that emotion seems to be overpowering the emotion of, I want to get something because I like it and it says something distinctive about me. So you could say that in order to overcome this notion of buying watches as a speculative investment where past performance is no promise of future performance, you have to create much more emotion in the side of understanding what this watch says about you and how this watch is distinctive. So it goes back to an education problem, which goes back to the fact that the internet, with all the available information, is oddly siloing people into a few different models. So the question then goes back into this idea of how, given the fact that we have so much distribution right now of information, how do we still overcome this problem that the emotion of buying something as a quasi-financial instrument seems to be more powerful with more consumers than this very pragmatic and practical traditional notion of buy a watch that you love? Because I still see too many consumers, while they even appreciate this idea, it's not strong enough for them.
The question I'm asked most often on the people email me, and the question they almost all ask is, which watch can I buy that will go up in value? And I have a pre-formed answer that I just tap in every time, and it is that if I knowing what will go up in the future means knowing what will happen in the future. If I knew what would happen in the future, I wouldn't be pissing about with watches. I would be living on my own private island and not listening to any of you idiots. So nobody knows the future. Understand that. So yeah, right now, if you can get your hands on a Royal Oak or a Nautilus at retail, yeah, you've got money in the bank. But, you know, I'm looking back at the story of the bubble backs of 20 odd years ago. I really want to go and look at what Shane Ormista was saying, and he was saying that without the grey market, brands and retailers will either scale down dramatically or go bankrupt. And when there's unsold stock, what do you think brands deal with the stock? And I think that's a really important question. And one of the things that I've noticed about the various forums we've had here is a complete absence of anybody from a manufacturer. I would love to have had a manufacturer here to listen to put their side of the story. I've seen the way that different manufacturers are reacting to this problem. Some of them are literally using the grey market. I know, I used to go to watch shows in the States, and there were wholesalers there who would have cabinets full of brand new watches from very well-known brands at 65% off retail. And the only way they could have got those was directly from the manufacturer or from one of those manufacturers' importing agents in a particular country. So that was one way that one brands are dealing with it. Recently, I know of two brands who've taken an alternative route. One is that one brand has actually taken watches back from retailers and destroyed them. And another brand has taken back high-value, complicated watches, taken them into stock, disassembled them, and put all the spare parts into stock so that they can be used in future for servicing. So I think different manufacturers are dealing with it in different ways. And what I'm glad to see is that some of them are actually acknowledging that there is a problem. And so Um, what I really want to know, though, is how do retailers deal with excess stock?
Let's hear it.
That's a very good question. First of all, I'd like to comment on what you just said. Yes, some of the manufacturers or brands have realized that the oversupply creates the gray market. So there are more and more, and being a retailer, we have interaction with this brand on daily basis. And more they are dealing with a sell-out-based mentality, which is I'm not going to push too much stock on you. I'm just going to make sure that your sell-in, sell-out ratio is at an acceptable level. Now, how does a retailer like Sediki handles extra inventory? Few ways to do it. First, you need to have a very good buying team, because the problem will come that from the point of buying. If you buy too much, you might end up with too much stock. So luckily, we have experts in our organization. The family has been in the business for more than 70 years, and they manage pretty well their buying so that we can make sure we don't end up with too much stock. Nonetheless, you can still, end of the year, still have some extra inventory. How we handle it, we are looking back at our consumers, at our loyal consumers, and when we have extra inventory, we just go, if I may say, on sale and offer special prices to our very faithful customer, but always having in mind the brand equity, the brand value, so we don't want to damage that. We don't want to damage the relationship we built for 70 years with the manufacturer. So it's a very below-the-radar exercise where we invite our best customers to come and enjoy special offers. But as I said, luckily we have a very, very good buying team and a team that understands the market, very adverse to risk as well, which means that when they buy and they feel that product might not be a success in the region, we will absolutely limit the number of pieces we will buy, just to make sure we don't end up in a situation of excess inventory and having to take a little bit of a cut on the margin.
So even if you are one of those responsible retailers who very carefully make sure that you buy what you think you can sell, that doesn't mean that the retailer a few countries away is doing the same thing. And at the end of the year, when they have excess inventory and they dump it, it ends up on the internet, it ends up hurting you. So the question is this: how many fewer watches do you think the industry should be producing each year? 50% less, 40% less? I want to hear a number. How much you think inventory should decrease?
I think the manufacturers are producing absolutely the right number of watches. The only thing that needs to change is the price at which they sell them. In other words, the manufacturers perhaps should do what the US Treasury did with the dollar and let it float. In other words, that it's an open market, that essentially a client walks into the store, makes an offer, and the dealer either accepts it or rejects it, makes a counter offer.
I mean, that's like a lot of what eBay is, right?
Exactly.
Is that sustainable, though, when you're trying to train a consumer to respect or value an initial retail price? Does that not completely erode away at that?
Yeah, and it's an idealistic idea. It couldn't possibly function because it would literally drive everybody bankrupt in the end. But you know, I'm not in the watch industry, so I don't care.
What do you think? How many fewer watches should be made?
Well, it's hard to say. I will rebound saying some should make more than rather fewer, so that we as retailers could please more of our consumers. I think that the industry altogether is getting there. They realize the problem at hand, that oversupply creates the parallel market, which then annoys everybody in the industry, especially the serious and faithful players. How many less they can do, they want to do, it's a very difficult question to answer. I think if they actually monitor closely, but on a global scale, means every single watch manufacturer, from the smallest one to the biggest one, actually really monitor the sell-in, sell-out ratio, it will come to having more or less the needed supply for the product without overstocking the retailers. And then it depends on consumer reaction to a product. I mean, even if they are careful in not producing too much, if the market is not keen to buy that product and that product is not successful, then you have an excess inventory problem. Even if your mandate from day one was, let's be very careful of how many we're going to produce. If we're targeting 1,000, we will just do 500. But if these 500 are not selling, you've got an inventory issue.
So you agree that there's probably more watches produced than should be, but there's no easy solution in terms of fixing that problem, correct?
Yeah, and as I said, on one hand, you have too many watches produced. On the other hand, some brands should produce more because the demand is much bigger than what we can offer.
And again, in theory, it should balance it out because consumers should go to the path of least resistance. And if this category of watches is unavailable for purchase, well, then this category over here is where they go. But that's not necessarily happening, and we've attributed that to potentially an education problem. Let's go back to the issue of consumers purchasing goods, and after they purchased it, whether it's through an authorized retailer or a peer-to-peer, they have an issue with the watch. And it's an opportunity for the brand or an authorized retailer to make a consumer feel very happy. But oftentimes, consumers are turned away, and a consumer that would otherwise be very loyal to a brand is now upset with the brand. What is the responsibility of a retailer or the brand and the industry in general to make sure that everyone buying a watch has as good of an experience as possible so that they buy more watches?
I'm not in the industry, I can't.
What would you like the industry to treat you like?
The thing that I dislike most about the industry currently is the practice that they've been introducing over the last few years of reducing or completely stopping the supply of spare parts to independent watchmakers, demanding that that any watch can only be serviced at the manufacturer's service center.
Does he now?
Yeah. If you do, babe, I can get you one. The simple truth is that the service department used to literally be operated as a service for the client. It is now a profit center of the brand. And I think that has had an antagonistic caused an antagonistic situation between brands and consumers, that they feel that their choice has been taken away. Once you own a product, once you own a car, once the warranty runs out, you can take it to anywhere to have it serviced. But if you have a Breguet, it can only go back to Breguet for service. And I think that has upset a lot of people and may well have may have instilled in them a fear against purchasing that particular brand.
A good point.
Well, as far as we're concerned, the after-sales service has always been at the top of the mind of the family. And since, if I'm not wrong, since 1964 or 65, the family created the Swiss Watch Service, our after-sales service platform. And except for a few high complications where the brand wants to keep control of the repair, like a minute repeater or tourbillon, our service the watches coming to us, they don't go back to Switzerland. We can service them on the spot here in Dubai with trained watchmakers, trained polisher, because the polishing is also as important as the watchmaker. But that's because the family had this vision of investing heavily into the after-sales service because it's part of the customer journey and part of these touch points that are extremely important as far as the watch industry is concerned. So yeah, except few very high complications, most of the repairs are done locally, but that has a financial constraint as a retailer, because if you want to do so many repairs, we're doing roughly 40,000 repairs per year, so it's huge for a retailer. but that means you need to carry an important inventory of spare parts. I'm going back to the spare parts issue. And we have, just to give you an idea of the volume of what we're talking about, we carry constantly 200,000 spare parts in our inventory.
One more question, then we're going to open it up to audience questions, and that is, what do you feel brands and the industry can do to support retailers like you? You've mentioned in several instances in this discussion where you've had to fill in, and I mean you as the retailer, Siddiqui, had to fill in with service or training or something where the watch industry is fundamentally failing or not offering to you. So you and other retailer groups around the world are essentially the first line of defense, or maybe the last line of defense. What can the industry do to empower retailers more than they're doing today so that retailers can fulfill a lot of those unfulfilled things better, more sustainably, and to a degree that makes consumers a lot happier? I don't know that Hublot was mentioned.
I'd like to answer Shame's question. Why is there no grey market for certain brands? There is a grey market for every brand. Every single brand that you ever want can be found on the grey market. And you could argue that the grey market is really the real market, because it's on the grey market that you will find the actual value of a watch. That is what customers are, that is what the grey market retailer is prepared to sell something at, and it's the price at which a grey market customer is prepared to buy it. You can find everything from brand new brand new Hublots to brand new Nautiluses. No, there is no grey market for the tiny brands, of course, because they're making single figures numbers of watches a year. But there is a second-hand market for them.
Related but different. Related but different. So what do you think about the question in terms of what brands can do to make the experience for retailers better? Because retailers are essentially having to foot the bill and the responsibility for so much the industry probably should be doing themselves.
I think the industry does support the retailers as much as is possible, but they don't. You have to remember that for the brands, the retailer is their client. Their client isn't the guy who buys the watch and puts it on his wrist. Their client is the dealer. So their relationship is really only with the dealer, and they will try and do as much as they can. But as always, as commercial enterprises, they're limited by the amount of money that they choose to spend.
Christoph, you're probably the best to answer this question. Do you feel that the brands are supporting you enough as a valued client?
I think we have to go back to, first of all, how the ecosystem has changed. And you rightly pointed it out earlier. Brands we used to have only the retailers as their front line started a trend about probably 10 years ago to open their own retail stores. So they're suddenly a supplier and a competitor. And I think along the way, some of the brands, definitely not all of them, forgot that there is still room for a partnership, and there is still room to work together. So how brands can help retailers is realize that be united is probably making us stronger rather than trying to divide. And the retailers has a lot to bring to the table, and I'm going to be self-promoting our group, an initiative like Dubai Watch Week should have been a Swiss industry initiative.
Agreed.
Or a brand initiative.
Also.
And it is a retailer initiative here in Dubai, in the Middle East, that has been for long looked at by brands as a small market, because it's a small percentage of the overall business that brands are doing. But things have been changing. Dubai as a market, or the UAE as a market, is ranked between 8 and 9 of Swiss watch export. So recognizing that together we're stronger than being divided, I think this is what we need from the brands, especially in some very complicated emerging markets where a certain know-how and a certain skill set are not necessarily available at the brand level, and having a good partner on the ground might bring more value rather than trying to do everything alone. So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you. Now let's open to some questions. Oh, you have something else? Oh, who has something to ask? A shame on wrist, huh?
I have a question.
Please.
My question is Shame's question. What is your take on bloggers selling watches? Everyone. And you too, Ariel. You can answer too.
Well, I've made my position on this matter very clear, and that is I believe you are either media or a store. Looking back historically on companies for a long time, I do not see a lot of examples or any examples of entities that can be successfully authoritative on a topic while also selling that same thing. That isn't to say that a media outlet can't sell things, but if you're selling what it is you're talking about, you're a store. That's my position on the matter.
I wonder.
Oh, you got his approval.
Thank you.
I wonder how authoritative and independent somebody like Hodinkee or Revolution Online can be talking about watches when they are an authorized retailer for that brand.
An excellent point.
I mean, bloggers, like you said, is first and foremost providing information, a media. And I think you cannot look at that and do not remove from the equation the conflict of interest, you know? How can you talk positively or negatively about XYZ brand and suddenly selling these brands or deciding not to sell these brands because of your own opinion that you've exposed to the public? I think it's a difficult situation to be in. And I would certainly agree with you. Retailers need to sell the watches, and the media needs to give an opinion and remove the conflict of interest from the equation.
Next question.
I'm Celine from Singapore. I've been writing watches for a while, and recently I noticed that one observation is that a lot of brands have sort of been focusing their production on stainless steel cases with integrated bracelets. I suppose it's kind of trying to get a slice of this market, which is quite lucrative to them, obviously. And earlier on, we talked about the demand and supply of certain brands and certain specific models. Do you think that, also brands, they tend to make what the market wants. Some brands do, and some brands, they do what they want and all that, but a lot of brands, they do what the market wants as a response. So do you think this is going to help to, dilute the attention away from the too hot watches? And will it succeed in, breaking the bubble, so to speak?
Okay, so just so shame on wrist, here's the question as well. You asked if brands today producing more watches to fill in the market of the stainless steel bracelet watches is going to dilute demand for the ones that exist right now that are very popular. I think that when a brand looks at the popularity of a Nautilus or Royal Oak, they don't always understand what it is that's popular about that, and they look very directly. They're like, oh, well, it's the design people are buying, so let's just emulate that in our own form. And I think that's incorrect. I think what those types of watches have been proving is that people want to wear known status items that's also a good daily wear. You don't need to worry about it too much. It's functional jewelry, and that's where the bracelet part comes in. And also that somebody wants to have something that is the lowest investment to get that name, right? So a stainless steel Rolex is, in theory, at least in theory, the cheapest way of getting the Rolex. So I think what the market says is we want easy ways to wear a brand that we like, and the market hasn't always done that. Gold doesn't necessarily seem to be an easy way or something that you basically don't have to worry about. People today, when they work, they don't necessarily put on a suit and tie and go into an office, which is very safe for a watch. They travel, they do leisure activities. They want to wear their watch all the time. So I think the market should start to realize is that people want to have better daily wear watches, If that happens and they're successfully able to do that, then yes, it will definitely pull away from sales of those hot models, but only if they also recognize they put investment into branding. Why is that brand even desirable? Bracelet watches have been around for a really long time, right? But the ones that have powerful brands behind them are powerful. So it's powerful brand plus a product that the market wants. That's the right formula.
Nothing to add.
But do
think
you
you're-
think they'll
you're-
succeed? Do you think they'll succeed? Like the brands that sort of jump into this bandwagon?
Enough of them will. Enough of them will. Because the demand for the type of product is so great, enough of them will get lucky in terms of creating more brand awareness and personality behind that brand. Because the idea is someone wears a brand on their wrist, they want that brand to mean something to them.
How
They-
much discount?
So yes, the answer is eventually yes. Next question. Over here, gentlemen.
How important do you think it is that wristwatches are one of the few items in the world that you can carry across borders without anyone knowing? So you could carry $500,000 probably on your wrist from one country to another. How important is that fact, do you think, to watch collecting, that people have more freedom to take large sums of money from one country to another on their wrist?
So the question is it very important for the industry right now that the idea is that you can put a large value of money on your wrist and travel around with it? Yes, that's certainly always going to be part of watches and jewelry. The idea that you can compact money.
But it's not for jewelry, because customs people know jewelry. They can see a valuable diamond, but they wouldn't know. I was told a few years ago there are 2 people in US Customs who actually know the value of wristwatches.
So it's
Whereas
an educational
diamonds, you
lag.
would recognize a diamond.
People have been educated that diamonds are valuable. People can be just as easily educated that a particular brand has
But
value.
the thing is, there are so many different kinds of watches and so many fake watches that unless you were an expert in the area, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
It's
So-
true. It's true that you
So
can
my point is just that
you can stealthily move money
you can-
around.
And I
don't-
just wondered how important is that, do you think? James, I'm sure.
I'll let James answer that.
If I really wanted to do that, Will, I wouldn't bother with the watch. I'd just have some really valuable stamps in my wallet. Postage stamps are incredibly valuable, take up no space whatsoever, and have an international value. So, well,
Can I just come back to the bloggers allowed or not to sell watches? I've got 2 questions. The first is, what is the difference between a blog being paid advertising by a brand and the blog selling that brand? And the second question, I mean, in how they could be biased. And the second is, these blogs have helped retailers and brands sell hundreds of thousands of watches, millions of watches. I've seen very few retailers monetize that, help them monetize that, take advertising to thank them. And how do these blogs live while they're helping the industry sell if they can't sell watches? I don't have the answer, but maybe some of you have.
you're the guy
Max,
who
you
runs
bring
the
some
blog.
good points, but I think what you're identifying is that these are measures of desperation. People would rather create media that is supported by healthy advertising. Advertising is an advertiser communicating directly with the consumer. As a consumer, we've been trained from an early age seeing magazines. This is editorial content over here, and right over here is an ad. Yes, it might be in the same publication, but it's very transparent which is which. Transparency is the key. You take away transparency, you have manipulation. You have manipulation, you have a lack of trust, you have a lack of authority. So anything that allows transparency is going to be sustainable. What you're identifying is an industry that does not know how to value media. That's a bigger problem than asking, what do you do in an industry when it doesn't value media, like that's going to be forever. It's unsustainable right now that media has to fend for itself. It's not going to last that long, and eventually there'll be no media. And then the industry will have to reevaluate what it wants its relationship with media to even be in the first place.
You're a blog to watch, obviously. Do you have advertorial on your site? Are you paid by brands to write about them?
Very clearly labeled as such.
No, I understand that it's labeled, but you're talking about the consumer trust at this point. So, I mean, it's advertorial and it's labeled, but you're still saying things about a watch that you kind of have to.
I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Max and I have actually had this conversation in the car, I think, going down to Boca Raton. And I felt very strongly at a certain point about, we talked about this last year, about reputable online industry publications who sold. Because I did feel the way you feel, clearly, very obviously, there should be a separation. But again, you're saying it because of consumer trust. Like, let the consumer decide. If the consumer trusts that this is a publication, that it's media, you know, then how can they think that they're going to be unbiased? But you also have advertorial on your own site. So I don't know. I kind of feel it's like you're really almost arguing against yourself, because if you have advertorial, I mean, you're not an editorial blog. Editorial is just editorial. That's, yes, you can have an ad, but you actually are writing advertorial. So,
well,
and you don't think that question, like a consumer would question that trust?
I'll answer it this way. Oh, sure. So the question is, there's a difference between sort of traditional banner advertising and what's very popular today, which is what you call advertorial. The industry normally would do a few things before they ever placed something like advertising. They would have a creative agency come up with the advertising, and then they would have a plan on how to distribute that. That no longer happens to a large degree. And they have basically forced a lot of media to be an editorial publication, but also a creative agency. So we've essentially had to basically do two things at the same time while there is a very real separation. The measure of the trustability of that is in the long-term look at everything and to say, are you just saying positive things about the brands that are also hiring you to do advertorial? Our consumer has said, we trust you because we see that you're giving full opinions when the opportunity arises, and the advertorial is relevant to us. The problem with a lot of the marketing today is it's not relevant to an enthusiast consumer. So in a market where there's a vacuum and no one is creating that relevant marketing, we've had to do that. But not all companies can have, I guess you could say, the accountability and the responsibility that we have in order to ensure that that level of trust exists. So I agree with you, it's not a model that you could apply to every single company. It really is about the personality. So it's not a sustainable model, but again, it goes back to the idea that the brands aren't investing themselves into making the marketing as well as distributing the marketing. I mean, this conversation, where it eventually goes, is consumers paying a subscription fee or paying for content. That's where all this goes. And we're not quite there yet from a cultural or technological standpoint. We will be ideally in a few years. So it's a very healthy conversation, but that doesn't mean the system is inherently flawed. It's the players that can make it flawed.
I want to thank Shane for participating. I'm a very big fan. When you're ready to take ads, Watchbox would love to be there. And I think we can find you Chronometra Blue. But that said, in listening to Ariel and what they're saying, I happen to agree. I think the wristwatch industry, to some extent, has to support the bloggers and what I call the enthusiast publications much more than they do. I think, I think Dubai Week and the Siddiqui family does as good a job as any retailer in supporting the press, this industry. But I do think that many of the larger brands, particularly the biggest, don't do a job supporting the enthusiasts and a lot of the writers that are in the room.
So Danny Govberg from Govberg and Watchbox.
Who is doing his agreement?
Lots of praise for you, Shame on Wrist. Wants to advertise with you as soon as you are open to it. And generally agrees that the watch industry has a distinct responsibility to support watch media and specifically watch enthusiast media.